Welcome to another episode of the Bleeding Edge of Digital Health. We've got a fantastic show for you today featuring a really exciting company called GraphWear with Rajatesh, Gudibande, and Meet Vora. Rajatesh is the co-founder and CEO of GraphWear, and Meet is the director of operations. Thanks for joining me today, guys.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. For the listeners out there, they all know how I like to start the show. I always like to kick off by hearing the origin story of how things got started. Those are always a fun story. In part and parcel to that, one thing I'd like you guys to talk to a little bit is just how did you guys decide to take on the holy grail of, maybe the holy grail of all medicine, which is needle stick-free monitoring of diabetes? I'd love to hear how things got started and what got you off into this vertical of medicine.
Thanks for the question. Surprisingly, we never started with needle-free. We didn't care about that. This is back in 2007, way back when I was in my undergrad. I got malaria, and what happened was I was in a rural part of India, very remote. The nearest city was 3 hours away by bus, and the road was not the best. And so when I got malaria, I was misdiagnosed. I was living in a hostel. It was one of the most severest form of malaria, cerebral malaria. Because of the misdiagnosis, they had to send my urine and blood samples a little late to the nearest city. And because of that, complications pursued. And I was knocked out. And I was in a very bad position. And then I remember being in a small room in a makeshift clinic in the college for almost a month.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was not good.
Were you totally incoherent that whole time? Like in a coma or in and out?
Fortunately, not a coma, but going into the extended recovery, which through an IV, I was on an IV for a long time. You get unconscious, you fall down.
Yeah. And
if you're not treated well, because your brain starts swelling and stuff like that happens.
Yeah.
Back then, I did not know it was cerebral malaria. When I even found out it was malaria, it was a little late. But, you get unconscious, shivers, it just persists. And then, it's a long road back to recovery if you don't treat well.
Right.
And my learning there was that there were not good doctors around. There were good doctors around. They had the good training and education, but there were also medicines around for malaria, but there was no testing lab nearby.
Yeah.
So I missed the information. And so, that was my first year of my undergrad in a rural plot. So fun fact, I got malaria 3 times during my undergrad, 2 years.
Oh my God.
Both the years following that year, I got malaria, but it was much better than the first time.
Wow.
So what this taught me was, going back to your question in the beginning, what it taught me was, well, we need timely testing. And now imagine I was privileged in the sense I could afford healthcare. My parents took care of me very well, but I still could not access it when I needed it.
Yeah.
So I realized I've got to do something about it. And that's when I came to the US and I met Meet in 2016. He joined GraphWear. We founded the company in 2015 and Meet joined us in 2016. And yeah, Meet, I'll let you share your own motivations.
Yeah, I studied chemical engineering in India and then went for grad school in the US for master's in nanotechnology, which is where I met Raj. He was 1 year ahead of me.
You guys were at Penn, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go Eagles. There was this one time we were having a discussion and he was telling me about GraphWear and his motivation behind it. When I was in India, my grandmother used to live with us and she was diabetic. And I used to help her take blood pricks in just helping her monitor her glucose.
Yeah.
And a few years ago, actually, she passed away because of a complication that arose from her diabetes. And so my motivation was every time I used to prick her, she would be in pain. And I wanted to not see her or people like her in any sort of pain, and they should not have to go through this just to monitor their glucose. And that's where it made sense for me to join the mission of GraphWear and journey with Raj in solving this problem.
It's interesting because after so many of these talks now, it's neat to see how personal struggles or personal experiences with failures of the healthcare system, an overwhelming majority, I don't even know what the numbers are, but an overwhelming majority of founders usually saw some failure in the system and their motivations were, came about as a result of it. I don't know any founders that just say, hey, I'm going to go start this company because I think I can make a ton of money, right? Like that's the motivation. You're in the wrong business. This is way harder to make money fast in this business. Go do it in tech, go do it in software as a service, something like that. But yeah, it's neat to see the personal experience and hear that side of it and what brought that about for you guys. So I appreciate you sharing that. Boy, did you take on a mighty task. Talk a little bit about the market and just how big is it? I mean, the diabetes market is how many patients? What's it valued at dollar-wise?
The motivation for our particular current go-to-market is towards needle-free continuous glucose monitoring.
Right.
And that is also derived from, let's solve the most basic marker for everyone, that's glucose. And diabetes is a natural consequence of not monitoring that. About the numbers, right? It's pretty interesting. Like everyone has glucose. The way you can regulate glucose in your body is through insulin. And so there are 2 forms of diabetes that are major, which is type 1 and type 2.
Right.
Your body actually produces insulin to regulate that, but sometimes your pancreas does not produce that. So that is type 1. So they cannot produce insulin. And type 2 diabetics are typically, because of their habits, because of their sleep, their food habits,
lack of exercise or whatever,
and all of the above, and many more, they actually develop a resistance to insulin. It's like the body's producing insulin, but your insulin now, it was produced in excess, way more for a long time, that your body itself becomes immune to your insulin.
Right.
And so there's a resistance. That's why it's insulin resistance. So around the world, there are 500 million people roughly who have diabetes, of which more than 98%, if I'm correct, are type 2.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I would not have guessed that it's that high.
Yeah, it's all our lifestyle.
Yeah.
And the worst part is type 2 diabetes is actually, in most cases, leads to the onset of cardiovascular issue.
Yeah.
And so, whereas type 1, on the other hand, if you look at in the US, we have about 1.4 million type 1 diabetics and roughly 32 million type 2 diabetics. Interestingly, just like half of the diabetic population are even diagnosed. We don't even know the actual who have diabetes because most of them are privileged to have the diagnosis done.
Right.
And that's the issue. So the market is like becoming into an epidemic.
Yep.
There are tools out there to be able to control diabetes, to be able to manage that, but the access is often limited.
Yeah, no, it is. And it's not just in, people think this is the case in third world countries. It's here. The pricing of insulin's been widely publicized. There's a lot of, I think Merck, they just announced that they were going to cap the price of insulin at $35 a month last week. So yeah, there's access issues abound, and it's not just in third world countries, it's here in the US as well.
About that insulin, right? That has been the biggest contributor towards lack of management because, insulin is one molecule which can control that. And that has been misused, I would say, by different companies, of course, to make profits,
right?
Which I don't blame them for. But when it was invented, it was signed off for $1, almost like that for people's use. And then unfortunately, people don't have access to that molecule that is so cheap to make.
Yeah.
And so that's a problem.
That's the argument, right? Is like, if we've got all these people that need it, why are we making it so expensive? And all these other drugs, they go generic and we sell them for pennies on the dollar. Why is insulin kept so high? And obviously there's people in high places that are making those decisions, but it's definitely, to your point, it's definitely an epidemic. And it's neat to see that companies are tackling big problems. Small companies are tackling big problems, and you guys are one of them. So I'm excited to get into it a little bit. But let's talk about the technology, man. It's a wearable technology basically for needle-free continuous glucose monitoring, right? Can you walk us through a little bit more about it? What's the secret sauce, et cetera?
The objective for us was to be able to sense on the surface of the skin the glucose coming out, diffusing out from your skin. So the technology has been built to solve that problem. We have a device, I'll just show it to you. It's a device that can mount it onto a patch, and then you can patch that onto your abdomen. Now, it's completely needle-free. Underneath the device, there's a sensor. It feels like a cloth, and it tastes molecules that, like literally glucose per unit time, that are on the skin. And then it converts that into electrical signal. The way that this works is you have something very sensitive in contact with your skin.
Yeah.
It's almost like an electronic tongue, tastes molecules so sensitively. And when it converts to electrical signals, it has to transmit that information quite seamlessly. And what we humans are used to right now is a phone and an app.
Yeah.
And so data goes real time to your phone, and you can see your glucose values pretty much like I'm doing right now with this app. So it's live glucose. It's broadcast me every 5 minutes. And yeah, that's how this works.
What is it about the needle-free design that makes that form factor so challenging? And then for those that aren't familiar, because not everybody's familiar with this disease state, how would this be different than like a Freestyle Libre product or something in that category?
The challenge has been firstly that we don't have a benchmark to look up to when it comes to solving the needle-free problem.
Right.
It's like all roads end at needle.
Right.
I'll go back to like, why did we not need needle-free? What we want is continuous testing.
Right.
We want continuous testing, but the problem with needles plus continuous testing is that people don't adhere to it.
Right.
So we needed to have a needle-free solution that's one click, easy to use, you forget it. And that's why the needle-free became very important for us.
Got it.
And now when we went around needle-free, like there's not much literature out there. So we're like, okay, what fluid do we first use? And what organ do we first access? We narrowed down, we looked at sweat, saliva, earwax. Then we narrowed down that skin is one of the largest organs in the human body.
Right.
And so we narrowed down on skin. And after that, the next challenge was, okay, well, we'll have to build a technology to be able to taste the glucose. We're talking about a dilution factor that's quite insane.
Right.
So we have to make something very sensitive. That's unprecedented.
Hypersensitive, yeah.
That's where the education also came in. In fact, not luckily, it's quite actually purposeful. The reason I did my graduate studies was to solve this problem after my undergrad malaria experience. So to do that in nanotechnology. And with the advent of nanoscale materials, I mean, you could see for the first time for so many years, materials being built in labs. And I was like, my mouth was wide open. Like, wow.
Yep.
What a great time to be alive with the advent of technology, because you have this nanoscale materials that are 1 atom thin, made of carbon, that can sit on the skin and has the best aspect ratio on the planet, meaning its surface area to volume is the highest possible.
Right.
So it's the most sensitive material on the planet. And then you can then use it to make an electronic tongue. And so all of that led to this moment. So the challenge was, of course, the lack of knowledge before this. But then along the way, it was we built the technology for that problem. But then practical challenges that lead up to this are how do you maintain the skin contact?
Right.
It's like you're tasting molecules on the skin. Humans don't want too much on their skin.
Right.
So we like to be free, right? So that's the challenge. Like, how do you maintain the snug skin contact? Because if it gets loose, it can't sample glucose. Sometimes women have long fingernails. When they remove the device, they can scratch the sensor. These are practical challenges that we have to face. That's easier than the early challenges we had to face.
That's fascinating. The big difference between this and a Freestyle Libre, even though Freestyle Libre is like a patch that you wear, it's still a needle that goes in, right? It's a subcutaneous patch or a needle that goes in, whereas this is totally needle-free. Got it. You know, we were talking before Raj jumped on about there's been a lot of noise in this space in the last couple of weeks, not just what Merck's doing around the price of insulin, but obviously Apple has made some announcements that they're making some advancements in this space, and this is a road they're headed down. I'd love to get both of your guys' thoughts on this. My personal opinion is anytime a big player like this tends to jump in the space, the rising tide lifts all boats. I would think this is a phenomenal thing for you guys, but would love to get your take on that.
Yeah, definitely. Especially a company as big as Apple, if they are making strides in this industry, it's only going to help everyone because they're going to educate everyone on the importance of why glucose monitoring is important. Like it's valuable. In this community, I don't think any one of us look at each other as a threat, but rather we're all serving to help the diabetic community. And a company like Apple, if they can do it, it's definitely good news for everyone.
Just from the sounds of things, they'd have a pretty long, development process, right? You guys are seemingly pretty far along in comparison to them. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So it's a little history, right? So Apple has been working on non-invasive glucose monitoring since Steve Jobs was diagnosed with cancer.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And it's been documented. So because of that, like he developed diabetic complications.
Right.
They have been at it for a while, long time. And they've spent a lot of money, way more than we can imagine. Right. But here's the thing. The technology that Apple is working with is quite similar to what we use today with your Apple Watch. Under the Apple Watch, the light sensors, they are called PPG sensors.
Yep.
Right. But it's basically light. Now, if you want to sense glucose, right, any molecule, you want to be able to sense it. You need to get an input. You need to get an output. You can have an electrical input. You can have an electrochemical input. But technically, you can shine light on glucose. And if only glucose and glucose unknown reacts to that light, you can get that light back and you can record information about that glucose. That's how you may want to do light-based measurement.
Right.
The problem is when I shine light through the skin, there's glucose, fructose, galactose, maltose, galactose. You have insulin. You have all these macromolecules, all these molecules down there. And so it cannot be specific.
Got it.
So if you want a more specific sensor, then you have to have something quite literally that can sense only glucose. And so you have to rely. And what's nice about the fingerstick meters, right, that have started, and that's why they're diabetically approved and FDA approved, are because they're very specific for glucose monitoring. They have a protein in there that binds only to glucose, and it's very specific. So our technology also is based on a very specific electrical measurement. So we know we're sensing only glucose.
Got it. So there's a specificity factor that is involved that seemingly would give you guys a more accurate reading than if you were to utilize another measurement or another form factor for the collection, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we can be less reliant on algorithms. We can be less reliant on any invariances in how the light has to go on the skin, through the skin. If light has to go through different skin tones, that becomes hard. We don't need all
determinants of health and health population issues, clinical studies with, making sure that people with darker skin and lighter skin are all involved in clinical trials. It's a very complicated problem. There's a reason that a market of 500 million patients hasn't been figured out yet. And it's not because there hasn't been people trying, that's for sure. So where are you guys at in the regulatory process?
So on the regulatory process with any medical device, it is important that it's heavily tested before it's given out in the market. And so in that pursuit, right now we are in clinical trials and we plan to be out in the market within the next 2 years.
That's great. So are you guys is it the pivotal trial you guys are involved in right now, or which trial are you in?
It's more of an early feasibility trial.
Got it. And then the pivotal trial is the one after that?
Will follow.
Got it. That's exciting. Are you guys measuring any other physiological metrics with these types of technologies? I mean, I would think that there's endless applications here once you build the roadmap, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Remember, we talked about malaria in the beginning.
That's where my mind went.
It started with that, but I realized that falciparum is a little hard to do.
Right.
Let's start with my dad's problem and to meet his own motivation for glucose, because it establishes the platform. We are sourcing from the skin, and skin is actually then sourcing from the blood. So we have the availability of 90% plus for the molecules that are in the blood. Of course, in dilute quantities. If we are able to, source them accurately on the skin, then the chemistry that's already available can be plugged and played onto our technology to make it specific. So we can then turn around into this. It's built like a platform. So we can multiplex. You can imagine different metabolites real time. And we have to also think about how the user will perceive this, because most of these markers now will be easy to do continuously. You don't want to freak the person out.
Right. Yeah. Information overload.
It's going to be a very interesting and exciting behavioral change around how continuous health monitoring will happen in the next few years. And GraphWear will be at the forefront of it, yeah.
One of the areas that I think I think would be amazing is, elite performance management. For professional football teams, professional soccer teams, that being able to monitor fluid levels and, salt levels. And to be able to know at halftime, it's going to get real granular real quick. There's the chasm has been crossed. Elite performance management sports management seems like an obvious next step for this as well, but it seems like there could be endless opportunities for you guys moving forward. You guys seem to have a really cool corporate culture up there, just in our conversations that we've had, and the office seems really neat. What's it like working there? What's the culture like? Give us an insight what a day in the life is like.
I'll just add to this part. When we are looking for anyone to join the company, there are certain traits that we are actively looking for. One of the things is they have to be highly motivated individuals with extraordinary ability. Very easy to find, right?
As I'm a recruiter, I know.
And usually we've seen that it's a common trait among people who come into this bracket. They approach problems with a very first principles based tactic. They go into the fundamentals of what the problem is to understand it and then come up with solutions. And if you look at the core team at GraphWear, the first 4 or 5 people, we are all from the same Nano Masters program,
yep,
but all had different undergrad background. I was chemical engineering, Raj is electrical, we have someone for physics, material science, different perspectives, but all would come to the same conclusion because of first principles.
Yep.
And there are so many times that Raj and I would discuss about how growing up and going into school like 6th grade, 7th grade, when we learn certain equations, we used to think like, where am I going to apply these things?
Right.
I cannot tell you how many times we've had this situation where we are trying to discuss and brainstorm on some problem, and those fundamental equations and fundamental concepts come into solving really complex problems into very simple solutions.
Yeah.
I would say the core of what makes each individual here at GraphWear, but I'm sure, Raj, you also have things to add on to this.
You said it well, Meet. That then translates to the culture, right? The culture is in any company is not born.
Yeah, it's created.
It's created every day. It's a process. It is a disciplined process. It's all about the details, and that's when a culture is made. And to what Meet said right now is literally we try to maintain that every day. We sometimes forget, we make mistakes, but we have instituted a process wherein every person is encouraged to think first principles. And every person, when we are facing a wall, which we face many,
yeah,
we realize, well, if subatomic particles can tunnel through walls, we are made of them. Why can't we tunnel through walls? Quantum tunneling, right? It's like, hey, you know what? There's for us. And then, of course, once we have that process, right, we do in data, We want to make sure every new person coming in, policed or self-governed by their group, their peers. It then grows and scales that way. Of course, you don't want to be afraid to fail.
Right.
And that goes hand in hand, right? You may try to attempt a solution to a problem, but you may fail miserably, that too. But that's okay. At least you're trying.
You're learning what doesn't work. And sometimes you have to figure out what doesn't work before you can figure out what works.
Effectively, all these pieces makes GraphWear's culture a very exciting place to wake up to every day. In fact, the worst days of my life, I just say, okay, I want to be amongst those group of people.
That's really cool.
I can get their infectious enthusiasm. Yeah.
I've been a part of 2 really high-performing teams in my life. One was in my professional career. One was in athletics. And, I think both of them were really distinguished in one way. They were very similar in one way, is that there was self-policing. That piece of self-policing is very important. If you put a bunch of high-performing people together, the coach will have to do much less coaching and the manager will have to do much less managing, because people will expect more of themselves and each other than the coach ever could. And I found that in both environments, where we were harder on ourselves, we were harder on each other than the coach could have ever been. And elite things were accomplished as a result of that. Then the leaders are free to go kind of think big picture vision. They're not managing the day-to-day time clocks, this, that, the other. They know that if somebody's not pulling their weight, the rest of the team's going to fix that problem. So no, it's neat, man. You guys have created a really, really cool company. Excited to see how things progress from here. I'm wishing you guys nothing but best of success moving forward. I know you guys have a round coming up later this year and some exciting things on the horizon. So we'll be looking forward to watching as things develop, and definitely as we get closer to FDA approval, let's stay in touch and maybe we can get you back on the show for a recap of where they were then and how it's going now, sort of thing. But really appreciate you guys both coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, Mike, for your time. I'll just add one more thing. For people who are interested in getting to know more about the company and to join us in this endeavor, please feel free to send us an email at info@graphwear.co, or just go onto our website and fill up the form. We need everyone's help, and there's a lot of work to do.
All right, that's it for this edition of The Bleeding Edge of Digital Health. Again, Rajatesh, Gudibande, and meet Vora of GraphWear. Thanks for tuning in.